The present time and the past are known. The future is seen only in shadows. Nostradamus. Human beings have always wanted to look ahead, not out of curiosity, but out of fear. Long before satellites tracked storms and algorithms predicted markets, the future was experienced as something hostile, something waiting, something that could arrive without warning and take everything with it. In the 16th century, Europe lived under that feeling every day. Plague did not announce itself. War did not explain itself. Faith no longer guaranteed protection. And so people turned their attention forward, not because the future promised hope, but because it threatened ruin. It was in this atmosphere that a physician from southern France began to write. He did not claim divine authority. He did not declare certainty. He did not speak plainly. Instead, he wrote in fragments, in symbols, in verses that refused to settle into a single meaning. His name was Michel de Nostradamus. To some, he became a prophet who saw centuries ahead. To others, a man who said nothing clearly enough to ever be proven wrong. But this disagreement misses the point. Because Nostradamus did not endure because he predicted the future, he endured because he understood the human relationship with it. 500 years later, his words still resurface at the same moments. When nations feel unstable, when institutions begin to fracture, when disease spreads faster than explanation, when history feels like it is accelerating beyond comprehension. In those moments, people do not ask whether Nostradamus was accurate. They ask whether he saw this war, this collapse, this unease. And somehow, his verses always seem to be waiting, not because they describe events with precision, but because they describe uncertainty with honesty. Nostradamus lived in a world where the future could not be trusted, and so do we. Tonight, we will trace why his ideas continue to haunt us, not as predictions, but as psychological instruments, because the future has never been the thing we fear most. What we fear most is not knowing how to live when the future refuses to explain itself. Before we continue, a brief pause. These long-form explorations take time to research, write, and produce, and they exist only because people choose to spend time with them. If you find yourself drawn into this story, a simple way to support the work is to like the video or subscribe to the channel. It quietly helps these stories reach others who might be looking for the same kind of depth. And if there's a figure, an idea, or a moment in history you think deserves this kind of careful attention, feel free to mention it in the comments. Now, let's return to the world Nostradamus was trying to make sense of. Michel de Nostradamus was born in southern France in December of 5003 in the small town of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. To understand Nostradamus, one must begin with this landscape. Provence was neither fully medieval nor fully modern. It sat between worlds. Roman ruins lay half-buried beside olive groves. Ancient astrology coexisted with emerging science. The land itself carried memory. This was a region shaped by repetition. Seasons returned with precision. Drought followed rain. Plague followed recovery. Life here taught people that stability was temporary, and that nature obeyed cycles indifferent to human desire. This environment would quietly impress itself upon the boy. Provence had long absorbed foreign influences. Greek settlers, Roman administrators, Arab scholars had all passed through, leaving traces in language, medicine, and astronomy. Unlike northern France, where theology dominated learning, the South retained a practical relationship with knowledge. Healing mattered. Observation mattered. Patterns mattered. Nostradamus' family belonged to the educated middle class. His grandfathers were physicians and scholars, trained in both classical texts and folk remedies. Medicine in this region was not abstract theory. It was lived experience. Doctors confronted death regularly, especially during plague years, when entire households disappeared within days. From an early age, Michelle was exposed to illness as a fact of life rather than an anomaly. Bodies failed. Treatments failed. Explanations often followed afterward. This taught a particular humility toward certainty. Knowledge could reduce suffering, but it could not abolish it. His childhood unfolded amid vineyards and stone houses under an unforgiving sun. Summer heat lingered long into the evenings. Winters were mild but damp. The rhythm of life moved slowly, governed by agriculture and disease rather than politics. Catastrophe was local, not distant. When Michelle was still young, waves of plague passed through Provence. Death arrived without warning and left without explanation. Doctors were blamed when they failed. Clergy offered prayers that did not always work. No authority appeared fully in control. These experiences produced a population attentive to signs. Weather patterns, celestial events, unusual dreams were not dismissed. They were noted. Meaning was drawn cautiously, never confidently. Michel showed an early inclination toward study rather than labor. He was observant, quiet, and precise. Unlike children drawn to certainty, he was drawn to ambiguity. He listened more than he spoke. When he asked questions, they were about causes rather than commandments. He was educated locally before continuing his studies elsewhere, but the foundation had already been laid. Provence had taught him that events recur, that disorder follows structure, and that explanations often lag behind experience. The soil itself reinforced this lesson. Roman stones reused in medieval walls, old beliefs layered beneath new doctrines. Nothing ever vanished completely. It simply reappeared in altered form. This would later shape how Nostradamus understood time, not as a straight line moving forward, but as a series of echoes. Patterns repeating under different names. Before prophecy, there was observation. Before prediction, there was survival. The Provençal soil had produced a man trained to notice recurrence, to expect instability, and to distrust clarity that arrived too easily. Everything that followed would grow from this ground. Before continuing, pause for a moment. You are hearing these words at a specific hour. Somewhere on the planet, time is moving for you in a way it is not moving for anyone else. That difference matters. I would like to know where you're at. In the comments, tell me the time on your clock right now and the part of the world you're listening from. Nothing more. Just a small marker that this thought passed through you here, at this moment. Michel de Nostradamus left Provence to study medicine in his early 20s, entering a world that promised clarity where childhood had offered uncertainty. Universities taught that the body could be understood through structure, balance, and classification. Disease had causes. Treatments had names. Knowledge suggested control. Medicine in the early 16th century was caught between tradition and experiment. Ancient authorities like Galen still dominated instruction, but empirical observation was beginning to challenge inherited assumptions. Students memorized texts while quietly noticing when reality refused to obey them. Nostradamus proved a diligent student. He absorbed anatomy, pharmacology, and astrology, which at the time was considered essential to medical diagnosis. The positions of planets were believed to influence bodily humors. Healing required attention not only to flesh, but to cycles beyond it. This appealed to him. Astrology did not promise certainty. It offered tendencies, influences, probabilities. It acknowledged complexity rather than denying it. After completing his studies, Nostradamus began practicing medicine during one of the most devastating periods in European history. Plague returned again and again, indifferent to scholarship. Entire towns were erased between visits. Physicians arrived hopeful and left defeated. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Nostradamus rejected certain accepted treatments. He questioned bloodletting. He doubted the effectiveness of purging. Instead, he emphasized hygiene, fresh air, and simple remedies. Sometimes this helped. Often, it did not. The limits of knowledge became unavoidable. Patients recovered without explanation. Others died despite careful treatment. Doctors were blamed, praised, or accused of heresy depending on outcomes beyond their control. Medicine promised mastery but delivered humility. During these years, Nostradamus experienced personal loss. Members of his own family succumbed to disease. No method he knew could save them. This was not a philosophical problem. It was immediate and permanent. Something shifted. Medicine had taught him how bodies failed, but not why suffering appeared patterned across generations. Plague followed routes. Wars repeated cycles. Disasters seemed to obey rhythms that individual choices could not interrupt. He continued to practice, but something in his attention widened. He began collecting historical accounts of catastrophe. He studied ancient texts not for authority, but for recurrence. What had happened before, how societies collapsed, how recovery followed ruin. This was not mysticism. It was pattern recognition born from exhaustion. Nostradamus learned that explanation often arrived only after events had passed. Causes were reconstructed. Meaning was assigned retroactively. The future, by contrast, remained opaque. Yet people demanded certainty from physicians. They wanted predictions disguised as cures. They wanted assurance that suffering had boundaries. Nostradamus could not provide this honestly through medicine alone. Slowly, his work shifted. He began writing not to heal bodies, but to record tendencies, to describe conditions under which upheaval emerged, to speak in ways that acknowledged uncertainty without surrendering to silence. Medicine had given him discipline. Plague had given him perspective. What followed would not abandon reason, but stretch it into unfamiliar territory. Knowledge could not prevent disaster. It could only prepare the mind to endure it. Formal study gave Nostradamus tools, but it also exposed him to rigid boundaries. Universities demanded allegiance to inherited doctrine. Certain ideas were permitted. Others were tolerated only in silence. Astrology, while taught, occupied a precarious position. It was useful, but suspect. Accepted, but dangerous when spoken of too freely. Nostradamus learned quickly that institutions valued order more than inquiry. During his time at Montpellier, tensions emerged. He questioned accepted medical practices openly. He dismissed treatments that authority insisted upon. His independence was noted, then frowned upon. Eventually, it became a liability. Records suggest that he was barred from completing certain degrees, officially for practicing as an apothecary without authorization. Unofficially, it reflected something deeper. He did not submit easily. He treated knowledge as provisional, not sacred. This marked a turning point. Rather than force accommodation, Nostradamus left. He began a period of wandering that would last years. He traveled through France and Italy, practicing medicine where he could, observing wherever he went. Without institutional protection, he encountered the world directly. These years were formative. Towns differed, but suffering repeated. Political structures changed. But fear remained constant. Everywhere he went, people sought explanations for misfortune. Everywhere, authority failed to provide them convincingly. Nostradamus learned to live without official backing. This freed him from expectation, but it also isolated him. He became cautious. Words mattered. Precision could be punished. Ambiguity offered safety. He continued reading voraciously. History, astrology, medicine, classical literature. He compared eras. He noticed how language preserved fear long after events had passed, how symbols survived regimes that collapsed around them. The absence of institutional certainty forced him inward. Without credentials to protect him, he learned discretion. He learned to speak indirectly. He learned that survival often depended not on truth, but on how truth was framed. This wandering life also exposed him to persecution. Scholars disappeared. Physicians were accused of witchcraft when treatments failed. The Inquisition loomed in the background of every intellectual exchange. Knowledge required camouflage. Nostradamus adapted. He began experimenting with form, writing that concealed as much as it revealed. Language layered with references that only the initiated might recognize. Meaning distributed rather than declared. This was not deception. It was pragmatism. His experiences had taught him that authority did not reward honesty. It rewarded conformity. Those who survived learned to speak in ways that resisted capture. By the time Nostradamus eventually settled again, something fundamental had changed. He no longer trusted institutions to safeguard truth. He no longer believed clarity was virtuous in itself. Instead, he believed endurance mattered more. These years without fixed position hardened him. They stripped away confidence in stable structures. They reinforced the sense that history moved in cycles, indifferent to human intention. He did not emerge as a rebel or a reformer. He emerged as an observer, detached, careful, quietly defiant. When he finally returned to writing in earnest, he would not do so as a physician or a scholar bound to authority. He would write as someone who had learned the cost of speaking plainly. The break was complete. From this point forward, Nostradamus would belong to no institution fully, and that independence would shape everything that followed. When Nostradamus finally settled again, it was not into comfort but into containment. He returned to practice medicine, but his attention had shifted. Patients no longer represented isolated failures of the body. They were symptoms of a larger instability, one that medicine alone could not resolve. He observed how fear behaved, how it spread faster than illness, how rumor often preceded diagnosis. During outbreaks, people demanded forecasts more than cures. They wanted to know not how to heal, but what would happen next. This demand placed Nostradamus in a precarious position. As a physician, he was expected to speak with authority. As an observer, he knew authority was fragile. Predictions invited accusation. Silence invited suspicion. Somewhere between the two lay survival. He began to write privately. These early writings were not prophecy. They were records. Notes on patterns he had witnessed repeatedly. Wars that followed certain economic pressures. Plagues that emerged after periods of excess. Political upheaval preceded by moral rigidity. History, he noticed, behaved less like a narrative and more like weather. He studied chronicles from centuries earlier and found echoes of his own time, different names, similar sequences. The future did not announce itself clearly, but it rhymed. Writing became a form of containment, a way to hold observations without presenting them as conclusions. He avoided declarative language. He favored suggestion. He learned to let meaning hover rather than land. This method protected him. The religious authorities of the time were not hostile to astrology, but they were intolerant of certainty that bypassed doctrine. To claim knowledge of God's will invited scrutiny. To imply cycles invited curiosity. Nostradamus chose implication. He wrote in verse not for poetry, but for diffusion. Meaning, spread across lines, resisted capture. Accusation required specificity. Ambiguity offered defense. These writings did not circulate widely at first. They were experiments in form as much as content. He tested how language could carry insight without claiming ownership of truth. At the same time, he watched how readers behaved. People brought their own fears to the text. They found confirmation of anxieties already present. Nostradamus noted this carefully. Meaning did not reside solely in words. It emerged between text and reader. This realization was crucial. The power of prophecy did not lie in foresight. It lay in participation. The reader completed the message. Nostradamus did not yet fully understand what he was creating, but he sensed its danger. Writing in this manner attracted attention from those seeking reassurance and those seeking control. He remained cautious. Publicly, he maintained his role as physician. Privately, he refined his language. He compressed, obscured, layered references across time, geography, and symbolism. He avoided naming individuals. He avoided dates. He avoided conclusions. What emerged was not a prediction machine, but a mirror. Readers saw disaster when they feared collapse. They saw hope when stability returned. The text adapted without changing. This adaptability ensured survival. Nostradamus understood that institutions collapse, doctrines fracture, and authority shifts. But symbols endure. Myths outlast regimes. Ambiguity travels safely through time. The act of writing had moved him beyond medicine. He was no longer treating bodies. He was documenting conditions under which societies destabilized. This was not rebellion. It was observation taken seriously. Yet he felt the limits of isolation. Writing alone risked distortion. Without readers, patterns remained inert. Without distance, insight dissolved into obsession. He needed a form that could endure misunderstanding. This chapter of his life ended with a decision. He would publish, not as truth, not as warning, but as record. The physician had accepted that cures were temporary. The writer now accepted something deeper. Meaning survives best when it refuses to explain itself completely. Nostradamus' decision to publish marked a quiet but irreversible shift. What had once been private observation now entered public circulation. The text no longer belonged solely to its author. It would be read, interpreted, and reshaped by forces beyond his influence. When Les Prophéties first appeared, it did not arrive as a declaration. There was no announcement of revelation, no claim of divine sanction. The verses were presented without explanation, arranged in quatrains that resisted linear reading. This restraint was intentional. Nostradamus understood that certainty invited resistance, ambiguity invited curiosity. Readers approached the text cautiously at first, unsure how seriously to take it. Some treated it as literary exercise. Others read it as astrology. A few sensed something more unsettling. Meaning began to multiply. Each reader brought context with them. Political anxieties, religious fears, personal losses. The verses absorbed these concerns effortlessly. A line that suggested upheaval could attach itself to any unfolding crisis. A reference to fire or blood found relevance wherever violence appeared. Nostradamus watched this process carefully. He did not intervene to clarify. He did not correct misinterpretations. Silence preserved flexibility. The text remained open, adaptive, capable of surviving contradiction. As interest grew, so did distortion. Printers altered lines. Commentators imposed explanations. Rumors exaggerated Nostradamus' certainty. Gradually, the man receded behind the image of a prophet. This troubled him. He had never claimed to see events clearly. He had described shadows, tendencies, possibilities. Yet readers preferred authority to nuance. They wanted answers, not conditions. Nostradamus attempted limited corrections in later editions. He added prefaces emphasizing uncertainty. He warned against literal interpretation. These efforts had little effect. Once the work entered circulation, it developed its own momentum. The verses were no longer read as observation. They were read as prediction. This transformation was not accidental. It reflected a deeper need within the audience. The 16th century was not seeking cautious analysis. It was seeking reassurance that chaos followed order. Nostradamus' work appeared to offer that reassurance without promising salvation. As his reputation grew, so did the distance between intention and reception. Admirers praised his foresight. Critics accused him of deception. Authorities monitored him but found little concrete to prosecute. The ambiguity that protected him also frustrated his detractors. Public perception simplified what was complex. The man became a symbol. The text became a tool. Both escaped their original context. Nostradamus continued writing, but his relationship to the work changed. He was no longer observing patterns alone. He was watching how patterns were imposed upon his words. This revealed something unsettling. People did not read to understand. They read to confirm. When events unfolded, readers returned to the text to locate them retroactively. Meaning was assigned after the fact. Accuracy was declared once outcomes were known. Nostradamus saw that prophecy functioned not as foresight, but as interpretation delayed. This did not diminish the power of the work. It explained it. The verses endured because they required participation. Readers completed the message. They supplied context, emotion, and urgency. Nostradamus had created something that thrived on instability. The text could survive failed predictions because it never committed fully to success. It could absorb contradiction without collapsing. It evolved alongside history rather than resisting it. This realization deepened his caution. He withdrew further from public explanation. He allowed the work to speak without defense. Control, once surrendered, could not be reclaimed. The physician had published his observations. The world had transformed them into prophecy. And Nostradamus now understood that once ideas leave their origin, they no longer obey intention. They obey need. As the years passed, Nostradamus' presence faded from the center of his own work. He continued to write, revise, and observe, but the world had begun to do something unexpected. It started answering his words. Events unfolded that seemed to mirror the verses. Conflicts erupted in familiar patterns. Authority collapsed in recognizable stages. Disaster followed prosperity with a rhythm that felt almost rehearsed. Readers noticed. Each occurrence strengthened the illusion of foresight. When kings fell, commentators returned to the quatrains. When cities burned, lines were underlined. Meaning was no longer speculative. It was confirmed retroactively. The future had not been predicted, they said. It had been recognized in advance. Nostradamus understood the danger of this logic. His writing had never claimed inevitability. It described tendencies, not destinies. But once events had occurred, ambiguity hardened into apparent accuracy. The text seemed to know more than it ever had. This was not because the writing had changed. The readers had. As Europe moved through cycles of war and recovery, anxiety deepened. The sense that history was accelerating unsettled people. Old structures weakened. New ones appeared without reassurance. Each disruption intensified the desire for explanation. Nostradamus' verses offered a peculiar comfort. They did not promise salvation. They suggested that chaos had precedent. That disorder followed shape. That catastrophe was not unique. In this way, the work began to function independently of its author. Nostradamus lived long enough to witness early distortions of his reputation. Admirers attributed certainty he never claimed. Critics accused him of fraud for predictions he had not made. Both misunderstood the mechanism at work. He was no longer writing into the future. He was being read backward from it. This inversion mattered. Meaning flowed from event to text, not from text to event. Accuracy was assigned after the fact. Interpretation became a way of stabilizing fear. If disaster had been written, it felt less arbitrary. The work's endurance depended on this psychological exchange. Nostradamus could no longer intervene without breaking the spell. Clarification would collapse possibility. Precision would expose limitation. Silence preserved flexibility, and so he withdrew further. Publicly, his presence diminished. Privately, his influence grew. Each generation found new relevance. Each crisis uncovered fresh correspondences. The work aged without decaying. History appeared to collaborate. This collaboration was not proof of prophecy. It was evidence of recurrence. Human systems behaved in familiar ways under stress. Power centralized. Trust eroded. Violence followed. Recovery emerged slowly, unevenly. Nostradamus' writing survived because it did not fight this pattern. It accommodated it. As the man himself aged, he seemed increasingly aware that his role had ended. He had documented conditions. Others would supply events. The future no longer required his participation. The haunting had begun. After his death, the process accelerated. Editors reorganized the text. Commentators overlaid interpretations. Political factions claimed alignment. Each act of appropriation added distance from origin and increased symbolic power. The work became historical. It ceased to belong to a moment and began to belong to periods of instability themselves. This is when Nostradamus truly emerged, not as a physician, not as a writer, but as a reference point. When society searched for reassurance, they reached for his name. When uncertainty spread, his verses resurfaced. The text functioned as an archive of fear and familiarity. What haunted people was not prediction, it was recognition. They saw themselves reflected in patterns that had appeared before. Their crisis felt less isolated. Their suffering felt less meaningless. Nostradamus had not explained the future. He had mapped the conditions under which humans believe the future is already written. That belief would outlive him. It would outlive centuries. And it would return whenever the world felt like it was repeating itself. As Nostradamus withdrew from public life, his work took on a different character. The urgency of observation gave way to repetition. Writing was no longer exploratory. It became disciplined. He settled into routine. Days were structured carefully. Reading followed writing. Writing followed silence. Silence followed observation. The rhythm mattered more than novelty. Insight was no longer something to be chased. It was something to be maintained. Nostradamus understood that ideas survive best when given structure. He refined the quatrain form, not for beauty, but for containment. 4 lines imposed limits. Constraints prevented excess. Meaning was compressed until only what could endure remained. This formal discipline protected the work. The verses resisted expansion. They refused elaboration. Interpretation could multiply endlessly, but the text itself stayed fixed. Stability resided in shape, not content. Nostradamus treated this as a craft rather than a revelation. He revised carefully. He paid attention to balance, cadence, and symmetry. He arranged centuries with deliberate spacing. Order mattered. The future, he believed, was chaotic enough. His daily life reflected this belief. He avoided unnecessary travel. He maintained predictable habits. He favored solitude over explanation. Visitors were tolerated, but rarely indulged. Conversation was measured. This withdrawal was not rejection. It was preservation. Nostradamus had learned that public engagement distorted intention. The more he explained, the more meaning fractured. The work required distance from its audience to remain intact. He allowed the text to circulate without him. In doing so, he transferred responsibility to the reader. Interpretation became a private act. Authority dissolved. Meaning localized itself in individual anxiety rather than communal doctrine. This decentralization ensured endurance. Nostradamus did not attempt to found a school. He did not gather disciples. He did not systematize belief. Systems collapse. Institutions decay. Forms survive. The quatrains function like containers. Each held potential without insisting on outcome. Readers returned to them repeatedly, not because they revealed answers, but because they accommodated uncertainty. Nostradamus had stopped trying to predict. He was maintaining a space where prediction could occur. This shift altered the nature of his work permanently. He understood that time erodes explanations faster than symbols. Arguments require context. Form does not. Rhythm survives translation. Structure persists when content is disputed. The quatrains were built to last. As years passed, Nostradamus' role diminished further. He revised less. He spoke rarely. He accepted that the work had achieved independence. The discipline now belonged to the form itself. Observers noticed the quiet. Those who sought guidance found little. Those who sought authority found none. What remained was the text, unyielding and receptive at once. This tension was the point. Nostradamus had succeeded in building something that could endure misunderstanding. The work did not require belief. It required engagement. It did not instruct. It reflected. By grounding his insights in form rather than explanation, he ensured survival across centuries he would never see. The physician had once treated bodies. The observer had once recorded patterns. Now, the craftsman had completed his task. He had created a structure capable of holding fear without collapsing under it. The haunting no longer depended on the man. It was embedded in the architecture of the work itself. Nostradamus' work did not remain confined to the world that produced it. As Europe changed, so did the reach of his verses. They traveled outward, carried by translation, trade, and fear. The text entered cultures that had not shaped it, yet recognized something familiar within it. This recognition was immediate. Readers in different regions did not share the same political anxieties, religious conflicts, or historical memories, but they shared uncertainty. They shared vulnerability to forces beyond individual control. This adaptability revealed something important. Nostradamus' writing was not European in its psychology. It was human. Across cultures, people responded in the same way. They searched for correspondence. They aligned events with lines. They treated ambiguity as invitation rather than failure. Meaning reassembled itself locally. In regions where astrology had long traditions, the verses were read as cosmic commentary. In places shaped by conquest, they became warnings. In societies under pressure, they offered reassurance that collapse followed precedent. The text did not dictate interpretation. It absorbed it. Nostradamus had unknowingly created a structure that survived translation. Symbols crossed linguistic boundaries more easily than explanations. Metaphor traveled where doctrine could not. This was not coincidence. The work relied on patterns common to all human societies. Power concentrates. Authority fractures. Excess invites correction. Fear seeks explanation. These dynamics were not unique to Europe. They were visible wherever humans organized themselves in large numbers. As the centuries passed, Nostradamus' name appeared in contexts he could never have imagined: revolutions, empires, technological upheavals. Each era claimed him. The verses did not resist appropriation. If the same text could appear meaningful across radically different cultures, what exactly was being transmitted? It was not prediction. It was a framework for interpreting instability. Nostradamus' writing did not describe events. It described conditions under which people feel compelled to search for meaning beyond immediate explanation. This condition was universal. The future, regardless of culture, is experienced as threatening when systems lose credibility. When institutions fail to reassure, individuals see patterns that transcend authority. Nostradamus' work offered that transcendence without demanding belief. This made it uniquely portable. Unlike doctrines tied to specific traditions, the verses did not require initiation. They asked only that the reader bring anxiety. Meaning would assemble itself. As global communication accelerated, the process intensified. The same verses circulated simultaneously in different parts of the world, attached to different events, interpreted in incompatible ways. None of these interpretations invalidated the others. What changed as the work spread was not its relevance, but its density. Each new context stripped away local meaning. Historical references softened. Cultural assumptions dissolved. What remained was not depth, but function. The verses no longer belonged to a place. They belonged to a condition. This condition was simpler than the histories that produced it. Anxiety traveled better than explanation. Fear crossed borders more easily than doctrine. This shedding was not accidental. It was necessary. A work that insisted on context would fracture under translation. A work that depended on local history would exhaust itself quickly. Nostradamus' verses survived because they did neither. They thinned, meaning became lighter, more abstract, easier to carry. Interpretation required less knowledge and more feeling. Recognition replaced understanding. This transformation altered how the work was used. Readers no longer approached the verses to learn about a particular future. They approached them to orient themselves emotionally. The text became a stabilizer rather than a guide. This stabilization was impersonal. The verses could be attached to revolutions or recessions, pandemics or political unrest. The details changed. The emotional function did not. Nostradamus' work now operated at a distance from events. It did not describe them. It framed them. This framing made the work resilient. Contradiction no longer threatened it. Incompatibility strengthened it. The more context the text entered, the less it needed to mean any one thing. This came at a cost. As meaning flattened, responsibility diffused. no interpretation could be challenged definitively. Authority dissolved completely. The text no longer belonged to any interpretive tradition. It belonged to circulation. This circulation created a strange effect. The work felt ancient everywhere and specific nowhere. It appeared timeless, not because it transcended time, but because it abandoned it. Nostradamus had not planned this outcome, but it completed the trajectory of the work. What began as observation became prophecy. What became prophecy became reference. What became reference became atmosphere. The verses no longer required engagement. They required presence. They hovered at the edges of discourse, resurfacing whenever uncertainty intensified, not to instruct, not to warn, but to reassure through familiarity. The haunting persisted not through clarity, but through repetition, and repetition, once global, no longer needed explanation. The haunting expanded. Nostradamus' influence no longer depended on proximity to his culture. It depended on proximity to crisis. Wherever uncertainty appeared, the work followed. This revealed the final transformation of his ideas. They had become less about the future and more about how humans respond to it. Prediction was secondary. Interpretation was primary. The text survived because it did not insist on a single truth. It accommodated contradiction. It allowed fear to express itself without demanding resolution. This flexibility ensured endurance across borders and centuries. Nostradamus had not built a philosophy. He had built a vessel, one that could carry different meanings without breaking, one that could be filled repeatedly without emptying itself. As the world grew more interconnected, this vessel moved faster. It appeared in headlines, broadcasts, conversations, always during moments of uncertainty, always when the future felt unmanageable. The haunting was now global, no longer tied to a man, a country, or a century. It belonged to the condition of being human in a world that refuses to explain itself. Nostradamus did not live to see the full weight of his reputation. He died in 1566, before his name became inseparable from catastrophe. Yet the conditions he had documented continued to unfold with unsettling consistency. Europe entered cycles of conflict that echoed the patterns he had observed. Religious wars hardened identities. Power centralized, fractured, and reconsolidated. Periods of excess were followed by correction. Each era believed itself unique. Each repeated familiar sequences. Readers returned to the verses. They did so not because the text predicted specific outcomes, but because it seemed to anticipate the structure of collapse. Authority failed in recognizable ways. Violence followed predictable escalations. Recovery arrived unevenly, never restoring what had existed before. Nostradamus' work did not age. History did. As centuries passed, interpretation intensified. The more chaotic events became, the more compelling the verses appeared. Disasters invited alignment. Crises demanded confirmation, meaning accumulated retroactively. This process revealed something uncomfortable. Human beings do not experience the future as open possibility. They experience it as threat. When that threat materializes, they search for reassurance that it was not random. Nostradamus offered that reassurance without claiming control. His writing suggested that instability followed patterns. That collapse was not unprecedented. That suffering had shape. This was enough. As modernity accelerated, the need intensified. Scientific explanation increased knowledge but did not eliminate anxiety. Technology compressed time, making change feel relentless. Information multiplied faster than understanding. In this environment, Nostradamus returned repeatedly. His verses circulated during revolutions, wars, pandemics, and political upheavals. Each event found its reflection. Each generation rediscovered relevance. The text did not require belief, it required uncertainty. Critics continue to argue about accuracy. Believers continue to claim foresight. Both debates missed the deeper function. The work endured because it addressed a psychological need that progress could not remove. What this endurance ultimately revealed was not something about Nostradamus. It revealed something about time. Human beings live forward but understand backward. Meaning is assembled after events have already passed. The present is experienced as confusion. The past is reorganized into coherence. This imbalance creates unease. The future feels threatening not because it contains catastrophe, but because it resists structure. It cannot yet be narrated. It cannot be placed. It remains unfinished. When disruption occurs, the mind rushes to complete the story. Nostradamus' verses functioned as a bridge between uncertainty and coherence. They did not illuminate what was coming. This mattered more than prediction ever could. To recognize a pattern after the fact is still to feel oriented. Orientation reduces panic. It restores a sense of continuity, even when circumstances have changed beyond recognition. They allowed people to feel that history, however violent or unpredictable, remained intelligible. That events were not isolated eruptions, but movements within a larger rhythm. This rhythm did not promise improvement. It promised recurrence. Nostradamus understood that recurrence was easier to bear than randomness. A world that repeats itself can be endured. A world that behaves without precedent feels uninhabitable. This is why the work persisted through centuries of transformation. Empires collapsed. Technologies reshaped life. Belief systems fractured. Yet the fundamental experience of time remained unchanged. People still faced the future without guarantees. They still searched the past for reassurance. The verses remained available, not as instruction, not as warning, but as acknowledgement. They acknowledged that uncertainty was permanent, that collapse was not an exception, that stability was always provisional. In doing so, they offered companionship rather than answers. This companionship is what lingers, not the accuracy of the verses, not the reputation of the man, but the quiet suggestion that fear, when recognized, becomes survivable. Nostradamus had described the conditions under which people seek prophecy. Those conditions persisted. He had not predicted specific futures. He had mapped recurring instability. The future never arrived cleanly. It arrived through disruption. This was the haunting. Not that events had been foreseen, but that they followed familiar forms. Nostradamus' legacy was not prophecy. It was recognition. Readers saw themselves in cycles that predated them. Their fear felt less isolated. Their crisis felt part of a larger pattern. This offered comfort without resolution. The work never promised escape. It promised familiarity. As history unfolded, that familiarity became a refuge. When institutions failed to reassure, the verses remained. When explanations multiplied without clarity, ambiguity felt safer. Nostradamus did not explain the future. He provided a way to live alongside it. That is why his ideas persist. Not because they reveal what will happen next, but because they acknowledge the limits of knowing. The future remains unseen. Only its shadows repeat. Nostradamus understood that humans do not fear ignorance. They fear unstructured ignorance. His work imposed shape without certainty. That shape endured. Centuries after his death, the same mechanism operates. Each crisis renews the search. Each disruption invites alignment. The text continues to absorb meaning without exhausting itself. The haunting does not end. It cannot, because it does not belong to a man or a moment. It belongs to a condition. Nostradamus' ideas survive because the future continues to unsettle us, and because uncertainty, once structured, becomes bearable. The verses remain, not as answers, but as echoes,